Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 6 game from the 2019 Marshall Championship. Now, if you followed the round 5 video, you know that I drew a game I really should have won against International Master Hans Niemann, and I was really frustrated with that effort because, you know, when you draw games you should win, it's always very disappointing, and the last few rounds really hadn't gone my way in general. So I was really hoping to kind of do something in this game, still being on a minus score. My opponent in this one was none other than Grandmaster Leonid Yudasin, who, if you've followed this channel for a minute, you know I've actually played before, because I actually played him in the tournament previously earlier in the month of November, which was like the Delugi Invitational event, and that one I actually had the white pieces and had a really great position, but actually totally pretty much had a brain fart, and it went really downhill quite quickly in the middle game, and then he kind of dusted me off with really excellent technique. So I was kind of still had very fresh memories of that game. Normally I forget, my losses very quickly, but that game seemed like such a, rapid turnaround from like better to losing. And so it was fresh, and I definitely wanted a little bit of payback. So in this one, I definitely, even though I had the black pieces, was going to try and go for it a little bit. So anyways, the one benefit of playing Yudasin is that he does play the same stuff relatively often, so you can kind of predict his openings a little bit. Like, he's always going to play e4. He plays a lot of anti-Sicilians. He plays the Italian with white against e5, and he also plays a lot of King's Indian attack type of setups against, French and so on, Caracan and so on. So I had an idea of what structures I maybe could test him in, and I just decided to pick one. And that's kind of the one drawback of sometimes having a narrow repertoire, is that you can really be kind of picked on a little bit. Definitely I was able to take advantage of that a little bit here. So anyways, without further ado, let's get on with it. So Leonid played e4, which he always does, and I played e5, and that was kind of my choice for this one, as I figured, what, I want to challenge him in the Italian. I thought that was a line where a lot of people actually sleepwalk through the opening a little bit, especially if they play it all the time, and there are a lot of little nuances there that I figured Yudasin wouldn't necessarily be caught up on. So after knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, this is really the first opportunity where black can kind of choose the path. There's knight f6 and there's bishop c5. They're both viable moves. I'd say bishop c5 at the highest levels is a bit more popular, because knight f6 does allow the fried liver attack with knight g5, but black is getting pretty decent play these days in the fried liver. But anyways, I actually opted for the move knight f6. And part of the reason I actually opted for this move, believe it or not, was not because I had something brilliant against the fried liver, which is extremely theoretical. Usually the line after knight g5 starts d5, e takes d5, then knight a5 as pawn sacrifice, because you have to deal with this threat on f7. And then normally bishop b5, check, c6, d takes, b takes, and then, the bishop normally darts back to d3 here, and here the line pretty much starts. There's all types of moves. There's h6, I think there's bishop d6. So later on, sometimes they go knight b7, not knight a7, sometimes they go knight b7, knight c5. All types of complicated stuff going on here that I really did not have quite a serious handling on. The reason I actually opted for knight f6 is because I actually knew Yudasin never played knight g5 and would go d3. And you might say, well, that's madness. What if he did play knight g5? Well, I had some ideas there, but really I thought, he's going to play d3. He's played it all his life. That's something that I can kind of expect. And that's, again, where being too predictable can hurt you a little bit. So anyways, after d3, I could transpose back to bishop c5 lines by playing bishop c5 now, but I instead opted for bishop e7, and this was kind of the structure I wanted to go for, where it's not as symmetrical, because a lot of times you put the bishop on c5 and the position is very nearly symmetrical, and it's hard to create some imbalances, and I definitely was kind of gunning for Yudasin in this game. I didn't want to kind of play it super safe, and so I definitely just want a position that was not exactly symmetrical, and that's why I went bishop e7. Anyways, white castled, which is normal. I castled, and here white played the move Rook E1. Not too irregular. The point is that you protect E4. Typically in these structures, white is going to slowly prepare for playing D4. So Rook E1 does prepare that. A little bit more usual is to play A4 right away, but it didn't change too much because after the move D6, which I played, now Yudasin played A4. And so maybe the point actually of playing Rook E1 right away was to discourage me from actually playing D5. Because if A4 came on the board right away, after D5, E takes D5, knight takes D5, there's not yet pressure on the E5 pawn, and maybe that's actually the nuance that's kind of important. So Rook E1 does discourage E5 or D5. And after D6 and A4, this position has actually been seen a lot in the database, and it's partially because of this line that it doesn't have such a great reputation for black. Basically, the point is that this bishop is very firmly secure on this diagonal. The point of A4 was that now after knight A5, the bishop can drop all the way back to A2 and not really be bothered. Another way to play the position is actually to go C3, and the point is now if I go knight A5, white can kind of go around the long way by going bishop b5, and then if a6, bishop a4, b5, then spin around to c2. And you could debate whether or not it was to black's benefit to actually play this b5 move, because now white may have a lever with a4 to actually open up the queen side. So that's another way to handle the position, but A4 is definitely the modern treatment and is the way of handling it. And you basically say, I'm going to just keep this bishop on this diagonal, have really good pressure on F7, and if you ever intend to open up the center with D5, I'm ready because the bishop is there just pressuring that diagonal. So very, very annoying actually, and it's for this reason that white normally gets a pretty pleasant advantage here. But fortunately, I'd actually looked at some of this the night before and had some ideas in mind. So anyways, after A4, I actually did go knight A5 anyway, and that's kind of the consistent plan. The structure is you try to get a Chigorin, Ruy Lopez Chigorin variation structure, where after bishop A2, which is played to save that bishop, now the move C5 is played, and this kind of pawn chain where you restrain D4, you also temporarily secure the knight a little bit more on A5, take a little bit more space is the kind of approved approach here. Now, the one thing that you can see is that by playing with the structure, my light squares are quite sensitive. And so, it's definitely the case that, white could potentially have a strategic grip at some point if he's able to fix the center in the right way. Some ideas are trying to play bishop g5, bishop takes f6, and trying to then go knight c3, knight d5, and pressure d5 that way. Although you do give up the bishop pair, and there are risks associated with that. Sometimes you just kind of wait a little bit, and you may go c3 and prepare the position that way. But essentially, now with my knight on a5 as well, it's fairly unlikely that I'm going to get d5 in any time soon, and so it's kind of hard for me to kind of change the status quo in the center. Yudasin here played knight bd2 though, and I think this move is already a slight mistake because it kind of takes away some of the flexibility in white's position. The move that's played a lot more is actually knight a3, and the point is with knight a3 that you don't cut off the oxygen from the bishop on c1, so it can potentially go to g5. And you also just keep the maximum flexibility. So you still have knight c4 as an option. You still can go c3, but you just keep that flexibility that you actually have with the move a4, and it's actually quite a decent move. The other point about knight a3 is that if I elect to bring my knight back to c6, then the knight might come to c4 kind of unscathed. So. But yeah, knight a3 would be the more approved move, the most flexible move. Instead, this move takes away a little bit of that flexibility. So anyways, after knight bd2, I now went knight c6 back. Part of the impetus for that is now knight b4 is actually sometimes an idea, hitting the bishop on a2. And I get back to, covering the e5 pawn a little bit more and just kind of re-centralizing my knight because it did its job on a5. Its job on a5 was to make sure my pawn got to c5, and, that was, job done. So after knight c6, white now played knight c4. And again, this is, still not worse for white or anything, but just taking away a little bit of the flexibility in the position. And you're going to see why that's the case in a little bit. So first, after knight c4, I now played the move bishop e6. And this move is critical. It's really important now that the bishop is actually blocked by the knight on c4 that I play bishop e6 at precisely this moment. And we're going to see why in just a minute. You could have argued in previous positions about playing bishop e6 here. But the issue here is that in a lot of lines after bishop takes e6, f takes e6, white has a very, very slight edge based upon the fact that I do have some semblance of counterplay on the f-file, but a lot of times the weakness of the double pawns here does begin to show at some point in the game, either with a c3 and eventual queen b3 pressure on the e6 pawn, or even sometimes c3 and d4, and then my center is just a little bit less stable. And so white can even spin around the knight with knight f1, knight g3, and honestly, it's quite difficult to get off any kingside initiative attack on the f-file, even though it seems that it's quite appealing right now. Note that even spinning my knight around to h5, which might seem attractive on the surface, trying to get to f4 before the knight gets to g3, would actually just run into a very simple tactic, knight takes e5, taking advantage of the fact that the knight on h5 is unprotected. And this type of position, you can see visually, is just dreadful. I'm a pawn down, I still have this ugly structure, and don't have so much to show for it. So really, trading those light squared bishops and getting that structural defect, you really have to think twice about, even though it's a common theme in some versions of the Italian, just not particularly this one, because the bishop on e7 is not as active and dynamically placed as it would sometimes be on c5, pointing at f2, where it would be more menacing if the f-file was opened. So because of that, after the knight c6, knight c4, now bishop e6 is super effective because I don't have that problem. All right, so that was kind of a long-winded explanation, but I think it's important to understand that because what follows here is actually something that gives black a quite decent position, a good version of the bishop exchange. Because now after bishop e6, white played the move c3. And this is a move that makes a lot of sense, but boy, would it have been a lot better if this knight was on a3 and I wouldn't have been allowed to play bishop e6 in this way. Note that knight g5, which might on the face of it be a little bit annoying, harassing the bishop, just runs into bishop g4, and I'm hitting the queen, and after the queen moves, I can just go h6 and then plop my bishop back on e6. So if like h3, I can just go back maybe and then put my bishop on e6, and it will land on that diagonal again. So instead, c3 was played, and after c3, now I played the move h6, just not only stopping knight g5, but also stopping bishop g5, because again, I mentioned that as a potential opportunity to play bishop g5, bishop takes f6. This is something that some players on the Super GM level were even trying. I saw some games that Maxime Vachier-Lagrave was playing in the structure as the white, where he's essentially trying to trade the bishop for the knight, and then trade the dark square bishop for the black knight on f6, and then spin this knight over to d5 and argue that there's some decent light square control and that the knight on d5 is pretty strong. I have my own opinions about this, but I don't think it's as scary as it would seem. Basically, let's say I make a relatively tame move like a6. Well, after bishop g5, let's say rook e8. I don't know. Let's say h6. Takes, knight e7, knight e3. Well, in many of these lines, black can try to go g6 and bishop g7 and then actually play for f5. And then there's also a device where black can sometimes go knight e7 to cover the d5 square. So it is a little bit dangerous, practically speaking, but it shouldn't be the end of the world, basically. So anyways, I don't even allow any of that stuff with h6, h3. And now I played the move Rook E8. And Rook E8 is actually always a very useful move. I believe I did a video way back, it was like 2-3 years ago, maybe even long, maybe 4 years ago, which was in the Chess Secrets You Wish You Knew series, where I talked about the Rook E8 Bishop F8 maneuver as something that's really effective, where you get the bishop to a defensive post, you eventually clear the E file so that the rook is playing and maybe even doing something there. And so this maneuver is always very useful in Sicilians, Italians, and even Ruy Lopez's. It's a very common maneuver that black will play, and here it's quite effective. After Rook E8, white played the move Knight E3, and this actually, again, in my opinion, is actually a mistake. The moves Queen E2 or Bishop D2, I think, would be a little bit more prudent. And the reason for that is actually very, very precise continuation, because after Knight E3 now, there is this challenge of the bishop on E6, and I have to be a little bit careful because I don't really want that structure. If bishop takes E6, F takes E6, there is Queen B3. So let's say I make a nothing move like A6. Now this type of structure is not the easiest one to play because D5 is always going to feel a little bit loose if I do that. And yeah, I mean, it's not that it's not playable. It's just a kind of strategically risky, and I didn't really want to go for something like this. The whole point, though, and this is the reason why playing the knight to C4 and blocking that bishop on A2 is so critical, was because now once it moves away, I can actually take it. And so now the point is I play bishop takes A2, and after rook takes A2, I have this one moment to actually open up my position and take advantage of the fact that the rook is actually blocked by the knight on E3 here. So my E5 pawn is actually only attacked once. And I also take advantage of the fact that the rook is actually on A2 and is unprotected. And, split rooks are never, so great. And so with this one opportunity now, I actually can play the move D5. And this just allows me to actually get a slightly, pleasant position because I actually managed to get that break in. And that's always the break if you can manage it in the Italians. That's the question. If you can get in D5 and take the center without, dropping your central pawns in some way, you're actually in a great shape, and just everything here seems to work. The really funny thing is if I don't play D5, I'm actually in serious strategic trouble. So for instance, if I play a move like bishop F8, which, seems kind of natural, getting the rook out, the bishop out of the way and opening the rook up on the E file, now white has the very strategically desirable C4. And all of a sudden, the light squared grip here, coupled with the knight already eyeing F5, means that I actually have no effective pawn breaks. And white here would just be strategically much better because, having the pawns on the light squares and then having a dark squared bishop means that he'll be able to operate a lot more effectively than I will. And this is one of those strategically, risky positions that is very, 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 very good for white to play and not good for black. And so it's funny where you have this one moment to play D5, but if you know it, you play it. And fortunately, I had understood this idea actually from the night before when I kind of studied these positions a little bit. So anyways, after D5, now E takes D5 was played. And after knight takes D5, you can see there's just no real pressure on E5 right now. And the issue is that if you play knight takes D5, after queen takes, I'm already hitting the rook on A2, and my rooks are connected, and if the rook goes back, I have bishop F8 if I want. I have rook A D8 potentially, just hitting D3. And, black's just clearly better. So it's funny how things like this can just turn a little bit. But I definitely kind of outplayed him a little bit in the opening here. So anyways, after knight takes D5, he didn't take on D5 with his E3 knight. He went knight C4. And this is one of the very annoying things about the structure, is that even when white kind of screws it up a little bit, and it's really safe to say that, black is, fully equalized here, white actually still has a lot of, good counterplay, because it basically turns into kind of a reverse Philidor, where white has, black is playing white. Black basically has more space in the middle, but white here has these really nice knights pressuring my center, and it's very important that I don't, make any unnecessary weaknesses, because he could really take advantage of them. And so this knight on C4 in particular is extremely annoying, because it's hard to, evict it. It's so solid there. I can't, kick it away in any way. And so there's a really nice light squared grip. And so even though I have more space, the job is not close to being, done. And it's still quite a playable position for white. But black is objectively fine. So I played the move bishop f6 here. I did have to now address the e5 pawn. This is the move that actually gives me now 3 defenders, so that's important. I just want to point out, just for the sake of kind of talking about this position, a move like f6 would just be very poor because you would weaken all these light squares. Knight h4, queen g4, knight f5 could be an idea. Also, this diagonal pointing towards the king is actually not great. And so it just goes to show how, you really have to be careful not to weaken squares. And bishop f6 is not what I initially intended with my rook e8 maneuver, but it kind of happened here out of necessity to defend the pawn. So anyways, after bishop f6, white now played a5, taking a little bit more space on the queen side. I don't think it's super necessary to do that, but it's definitely playable. I think the pawn was effective, binding on the b5 square here. And so you could argue that white could have done a little bit better by moving the bishop or getting the queen off the back line, or even honestly playing rook a1, because now the rook on a2 is misplaced. But a5 is not a mistake or anything. And after a5, I now just went queen d7 because, I tout this all the time. The side that connects their rooks first normally has, really great chances. Normally actually wins the game, I've observed. The side that connects their rooks first normally, wins the game. So I'm just trying to connect my rooks and get my a8 rook in the game. Maybe I can even pressure d3 at some point. So that would be the kind of the ideal. So after queen d7, white played queen b3. Makes a lot of sense. The d3 pawn is not as weak as it looks necessarily, and it's almost like one of these pawns in the Sicilian, like the d6 pawn a lot of the times, where it doesn't have protection by other pawns, but it's surprisingly difficult to win because the e5 pawn is also requires so much attention. And on b3 now the queen is eyeing this diagonal, but also keeping my b7 pawn under observation. So makes a lot of sense. I now went rook a d8. Just centralizing. That kind of seemed to be my default decision when in doubt, just centralize your pieces. Maybe something good will happen. The computer actually slightly preferred rook e6 instead. And part of the reason for that is after bishop e3, which seems really annoying actually, going after my c5 pawn, I actually was not so sure how to deal with this. I was probably going to just chop the bishop on e3 and argue that, even though white has a nice light squared grip, I do have a bishop and the d3 pawn is a little sensitive. That actually wouldn't have been correct. The computer prefers white by a tiny bit here, but it's still close to equal. The move that the computer wants is actually rook b8. And the lines are kind of weird, but the point is that after bishop takes c5, I actually have knight f4. And this knight on f4 is all of a sudden kind of an octopus knight, threatening some sensitive spots on white's king side and also getting at the d3 pawn. So this would have been very high class type of stuff, but I just did not see giving up the pawn temporarily, especially the c5 pawn temporarily for this type of move. I saw it in lines where I give up the e5 pawn, but not the c5 pawn. So, anyways, I went rook a d8. And then rook a1 was played, which I think is quite reasonable, getting that rook back into the game. And now I actually went rook e6 because I did envision, ideas of maybe transferring the rook along the third rank. I did see my queen potentially lining up against h3, but I thought in a lot of these lines that my bishop would actually go to e7 to protect c5. So that was kind of my thought there. And then after bishop d2, which was played, I now played a6, and a6 is a little bit questionable because you might say I'm just creating a weakness here on b6, but I was really wary of this move a4 all the time, and a6 all the time, and you always have to wonder, well, is this move going to be more of a weakness or a strength? I just had some nightmares about the a6 pawn being on the board a long time and then eventually queening if to knight takes b6 tactic or something like that. And I just wanted to play a6 and fix this pawn as a potential weakness because now that the now that the pawn is on a5 and it needs to be protected by the knight on c4. And so I thought if the knight ever moves, then that might be a problem. One can argue, though, by playing a6, I never can actually challenge the knight on c4, and that's actually somewhat of an issue because in some lines, maybe b5 becomes an option at some point, but now after a6, there's always en passant. So the computer does not love a6. It tends to prefer queen c8 or rook b8, even rook d8, really all relatively defensive, patient moves that just keep the status quo of the pawn structure. So, but I was a little bit more committal. Hey, I'm human. What can you do? So, after a6, White now played bishop e3, and c5 is something that I have to deal with. I wasn't so keen on giving up the knight for the bishop, and so I went bishop e7, and that's why I went rook e6 so that I can actually drop the bishop back to e7 and still actually have the e5 pawn protected. So that was actually a very key part of my maneuvering, and in some lines I did think rook g6 was going to be an attractive move. So after bishop e7. Now queen a3 was played, attacking this pawn on c5 again. And Yudasin's getting a little frisky here, starting to kind of challenge my somewhat wobbly center. And I decided to defend that by playing the move knight c7. And the point of knight c7 is now I actually indirectly defend the c5 pawn, because if you take on c5, I have knight b5, and the queen can't actually stay on this diagonal and protect the bishop on c5, so I'd actually just pick it up. The computer actually does not, it doesn't hate knight c7, but it actually clamors for the move bishop f8. And it's funny because that's kind of the natural maneuvering move, but I was like, well, what's the point of just giving up the pawn? And the point is actually after bishop takes c5, again, rook g6 is now very effective in conjunction with knight f4. Queen takes h3 is a threat now in some lines, and all of a sudden black's actually getting somewhere. So very, very dangerous to kind of go for this pawn now, and very, very interesting way to play. But I just decided to kind of hold that posture and play knight c7. Which also, uncovers the d3 pawn. So now all of a sudden, White has that thing to deal with. So after knight c7, queen b3 was played. I think that's, quite decent. The point is that this d3 pawn is not more valuable than the b7 pawn. And so making that type of trade would be a, awful idea. I was not going to, make that mistake. So instead, I played the move knight b5, just kind of, blocking the queen here. And I must say, even though I didn't manage to kind of hassle the knight out of the way here, I was quite happy with my knights here, kind of just, shoring up my queen side enough where, Yudasin wasn't getting any targets on it. And I thought that my knight was, on what you can somewhat call an outpost, although I guess the knight on c4 is definitely on a better outpost. I thought that, I had things under control. After knight b5, Yudasin went rook a d1, finally defending that pawn. And now I went queen c7. And now the point is I've defended everything. My pawns are kind of secure. Now I can start attacking his pawns. And so now a5 is a little bit sensitive. And you could see that my whole a6 plan to fix the a5 pawn as a weakness, kind of made some sense. After queen c7, White now played queen a2, just defending that pawn, and that move makes a lot of sense as well. I'm just covering it and keeping the status quo. Now, it's always funny because, again, I need to kind of continue to make improvements in this position, but you don't want to be reckless, because if I move my rook to g6 too soon, maybe e5 will come under fire. If I play f6, this diagonal is too loose. So I have to be very, very careful here not to screw everything up. And that's why here I played the move bishop f8, just remaining patient and just keeping my pieces relatively covered on the right squares and so on. Note actually here, every piece in my position is actually protected. And the reason for that is because White is really trying to potentially loosen up my position in various ways, and I need to kind of cover all my bases before I go forward. So bishop f8 I thought was a nice move, just tucking my bishop away. That was the whole point of the rook e8 bishop f8 maneuver, was to actually do that. So after bishop f8, White played knight b6. And this makes some sense. Basically, breaking the protection or breaking the attack against the a5 pawn, maybe freeing up the queen to do something. Also, maybe eyeing the d5 square in some lines, although I didn't totally buy it because it's not going to be a great anchor with just the queen there. I think the knight was better just on c4. I don't think knight b6 is actually like a stunner, but I don't know. Maybe it's also somewhat of an indirect draw for where he's going to go knight b6 and knight c4 back. I don't know. The one thing that obviously my antenna lit up just for a moment with knight b6 because I was like, well, can I play knight takes e5, knight takes a5? I have a rook and a queen on the b6 square. Does that actually work? I wound up playing the move rook e8. And part of the reason I did that is because I realized that if I play knight takes a5 after queen takes not after queen takes a5, there's actually this move knight d5 here. And the problem is I'm actually, I think losing an exchange because the a5 knight is hanging and my queen no longer has space in this diagonal. And if I move away, let's say, and just try to trade knights, then I run into a fork with c4. And so I can't actually take this pawn right away. And so my idea with knight d8, rook d8 was that now I'm actually renewing the threat of knight takes a5 because I have this square on d8 for my queen. I have another square on the diagonal. The other point, by the way, is that if I play knight takes a5 right away, white also has the opportunity to just trade the queens here if they want and then take on e5 because I don't have the rook on e8, so I don't have protection of the e5 pawn. So with rook d8, rook de8, I'm actually protecting the pawn again and actually giving my queen the diagonal. So it's one of those things we call a multi-purpose move. So after rook d8, knight d2 was played, and knight d2 is actually, in my opinion, just a little bit of an oversight on Yudasin's part because I think he still thought that this knight d5 resource was present in the position and that taking on a5 wasn't really possible. And I tried to figure out maybe what I had missed, but I checked it for like 5 minutes or so, and then I realized, well, this just seems to be winning a pawn. So I actually went for it now, knight takes a5. And once I played this, Yudasin was kind of visibly shaken. He was not happy with what had transpired, and that kind of told me right away, oh, I think I did something good here. Again, the point is that, my queen has the space on the diagonal. Unfortunately, Yudasin did not play the best move here, and it actually turns out that knight d5 is the best move. The point is that after queen d8, White's position is, still fairly decent, and he can claim compensation with knight e4. With these knights in the center and the light squared grip, he's, eyeing c5. I can go b6, or I can try to go knight c7 and, get to some type of endgame like this, where the material's equal and I have a slightly more active knight. Or I can play this b6 move, where I try to defend the pawn, but white can continue forward with his initiative with b4, and after c takes b4, knight b7, and rook a1, you can see here that even though black is a healthy pawn up, white does have a lot of activity here and counterplay against my queen side. And my knight on b7 is not really a great piece right now. So I think white here would still have excellent chances, and it's by no means anywhere near lost. I think black is just slightly better. So basically there are resources even in the position where he blunders a pawn, and I think that's kind of goes to show how this light squared grip, this almost reverse Philidor type of setup in the Italian is quite a resilient one because, pawn down, still playable. Instead, though, he actually opted for queen takes a5, and this one is not ideal because after queen takes b6, I still have the structural advantages, and and I managed to trade a piece, which is going to help me a little bit, and the d3 pawn might become a little bit more of a weakness if there's less dynamic play in the position. So here, white played queen takes b6, rook takes b6, and here I felt really, really good because this d3 pawn is now kind of a weak backward pawn, and I kind of have this Maroczy bind against the d4 square, so it's not very impressive. And Yudasin, I think, is still a little bit upset and a little bit shaken because he made a series of moves that really did more harm to his position than good. I think he can turtle here for a while in a variety of ways, but instead here he played the move knight e4, which is reasonable, but after rook c6, just defending that pawn, he played the move c4, and c4 is truly a dreadful move because basically now the d3 pawn is forever a backward pawn, and it just gives me another target to work with. Whereas with the pawn on c3, my knight was relatively, out of action for now, and also I just didn't have any great target at the moment, so it would have been definitely a more difficult squeeze. Instead, g4 would have been more viable. You try to hold the knight on e4 as long as you can and just kind of try to turtle out the position. And it's going to require some really good maneuvering on my part to show that, I can win this game. After c4, I went knight c7, and now all of a sudden I'm like, oh boy, I have this excellent potential outpost on d4. I can at least eye the square. And then from e6, I'm also protecting c5, so I free my rook to do things. So I felt really, really good at this point that I must be winning. White now played f4, trying to open up the position further. I played e takes f4, and I felt happy about this. Please open the position further. And after bishop f takes f4, I have to be a little bit careful. There is knight f6 check discoveries. And in some lines, actually, there were bishop takes h6 and then knight f6 moves. So if my rook is not on the c5, I have to be a little bit, on the 6th rank, I have to be a little bit careful about bishop takes f6, bishop takes h6, knight f6 stuff. But I played the move here, knight e6. And fortunately for me, the thing that I did notice was that if you try to go bishop takes h6 here, taking advantage of this fork, I have the move f5, which is just a double attack and will net material. So it doesn't quite work in actuality. So after knight e6, I now have really great chances. I have great bind on d4, really nice square for my knight, and my rook on c6 is free to improve. White played bishop e3. I went rook d8, just kind of hammering away at the weakness now, getting my rook off the potential forking idea. And after knight c3, I think, just trying to head for this outpost on d5, I now went rook b6. And I thought this was really perfect timing now to get at a new weakness on b2. After rook d2, I now went rook b3, and I thought I was really playing pretty well here because in, just a few moves, I've kind of really, turned up the heat. I'm pressuring. My rooks are really excellently placed. I have a pretty good bind. The only piece that's not amazing is my bishop on f8, but, it has some role to play. It's defending the c5 pawn. I thought if I improved that, it would just be over. And now after knight d5, here I probably could have shown a little bit better technique because basically what happened is I realized here, wow, I've improved my position so greatly. And the question was, okay, almost all my pieces are in good squares. How do I keep that going? How do I play for even more? And I was, thinking about it, and I landed on bishop d6. But the move that I really wanted to play and I didn't play was the move b5. And, unsurprisingly, it turns out b5 is actually the best move. The reason I was a little bit held up on it was because I wasn't sure if it was such a smart idea to kind of trap my own rook. But the point is that with b5, I'm not actually going to play b4. I'm actually going to go a5, a4, and kind of turn up the heat that way, because as long as the knight is on d5, white can actually play c takes b5. So because of that, I actually can kind of keep this tension and then, push the other a pawn and only play b4 or b takes e4 when I'm, ready to. Now, the one thing was that after b5, I was like, well, what about rook a1? Because now, I've kind of weakened my queen side, it looks like. a6 is loose. But actually, rook a1 just doesn't work. The issue is that b takes c4 wins material, because if d takes c4, I have rook takes e3, and unfortunately the rook on d2 is just hanging. And so because of that, white actually doesn't have time to slow down my steamroller on the queen side and would basically have to go king f2 before rook a1. But now after a5, if you go rook a1 now, I have a4, and you could see the pawns are just kind of running. And so this would have been the way to kind of, turn up the heat in the kitchen, and get the play going, and I just didn't really see that important detail. Note that if you play like knight c3, trying to kind of, target these pawns still, now I can take on c4, take on d2, and then take on b2, and there's just too much here. Black is just winning. So, yeah, that was kind of the key detail that I missed. Instead, I played bishop d6, and it kind of began a series of somewhat questionable maneuvering that gave white, a little bit of a chance to get back in the game. After bishop d6, king f1 was played, and the thing I was always wrestling with was like, okay, now what? Because I thought maybe if I go bishop e5, maybe there's bishop takes h6 or some type of discovery against with the rook on e1. And I wasn't really sure how to proceed. And I was thinking about g5, but I wasn't sure if I want to allow knight f6 check or something along these lines. So I played the move bishop g3, which I thought, well, at least it fixes these pawns for now. It doesn't allow white to expand and take space. Turns out g5's better. And the point is that this check doesn't really do anything, and I get to play king g7 next anyway. So after king e2, king g7, I've taken more space, and potentially, my knight still is this great outpost on e6, and I can, start to advance. And again, when you're better, you want to, continue to advance your pieces, improve on both sides of the board, and that's the type of thing that, I could do here. Now, I have to be a little bit wary or careful about king d1, king c2, because, again, my rook is kind of trapped right now. So maybe I want to throw in b5, maybe bishop e5, just to target the b2 pawn might also be sensible before going for this kingside expansion. But g5 is a part of that plan, and it's funny because I wound up doing this later in the game, but it's kind of prudent now. So I went bishop g3, attacking that rook. And white actually played bishop f2, and this was precisely the scenario I want to avoid, something where like the knights were kind of hopping around, and I thought this knight could be a tricky asset. And so I actually avoided the trade of bishops here and went for the move bishop f4. But this is truly a disastrous decision, or a really questionable decision, because basically what I'm saying is that I'm willingly giving up a bishop for a knight, which greatly increases his drawing chances. Quite frankly, I talk about it all the time, the advantage of the bishop pair. But in a lot of circumstances, even the bishop versus the knight is just a better piece, particularly with pawns on both sides of the board. And my calculus here to give up the bishop was really not great, because it also means that we trade a pair of pawns, which kind of alleviates some of the pressure in the position. So I'm trading a backward pawn on d3 for really nice pawn on c5, and that's just not what I should be doing. And then last but not least, when you are pressing, a lot of the time, trading, when you are up a pawn, usually trading more pawns is helpful to the defending side. So for all these reasons, it's just not actually a great choice. Instead, bishop takes f2 was just much better, and after king takes f2, I still have this b5 move, and now that now the bishops are gone, I actually also have knight d4 whenever I want it, which, kind of prevents this king on f2 from really getting more active and kind of heading towards, c2, which was always my fear with this rook being trapped. I'd always have knight d4 check now. So, yeah, should have gone for this bishop takes f2, but instead I went bishop f4, thinking that he wouldn't take the bishop for some reason. Of course, that's kind of nonsensical, because he has to hold the b2 pawn and the d3 pawn. And so he took it on f4, and after knight takes f4, of course I'm converging on this d3 pawn 3 times, but now he takes on c5, and now there are a series of trades, because I go knight e6 back first just to make sure this rook doesn't invade, and after bishop e3, I now take on d3, and we arrive at this endgame where I am a pawn up and have a knight, but yeah, it's going to be very, very tricky to win just because the bishop is very resilient. And it actually reminds me in a lot of ways, again, about an endgame I actually showed in a game previously in this series against International Master Justin Sarkar. So if you want to find that game, Justin Sarkar versus myself, it actually, I think, happened in October of 2019, so not too far from this game. You'll see a very similar ending where I had a rook and knight versus rook and bishop, and I was up a pawn, but, white really had excellent drawing chances throughout, and I was really quite fortunate to win. Now, luckily for me, the circumstances here are better than in that endgame. For starters, my knight has an outpost, which was not really the case in that ending. And also, I'm just starting from a more active position where my rook is also pretty decent on the third rank. I can go to b3 and do some things. But what you're going to find in a lot of these positions is that the more pawns get traded, the better the chances are. And just keep that element in mind as we move through this. So after rook d3, rook takes d3, rook e2 is played. That is a very good move, just covering the second rank. And I now went g5. And g5 is a great move. I mean, you want to take space on the king side, try to fix the pawns on the king side as weaknesses. And so in some reality, I'd love to go h5, h4, king g7, king g6. And then maybe f5 at some point, but I do like the outpost for my knight on e6, so I'm not going to rush that. And the benefit of having that on e6 is also ensures that the white's rook doesn't really get active, which is important. I want to restrain white's activity. So after g5, king f2 was played. Not very precise. Actually, the computer says that king f2 is a losing move, which is kind of interesting because it doesn't seem like anything drastically has changed. But the point is that a move like bishop d2 improves the bishop's position immediately, and that's actually of the utmost priority because right now the rook on e2 is kind of babysitting the bishop and also babysitting the pawn on b2. And so if the bishop gets to c3, it's on a nice long diagonal where it can actually do some stuff. So that's why king f2 is not ideal. And here I played the move h5, trying to continue with my plan of actually fixing these pawns on the king side. Actually turns out that I had two winning moves and h5 was not one of them. Why don't you actually pause the video and actually guess if you can find one of the two possible winning moves in this position. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out how you would go in this position. The two moves that were winning here were f5 and rook b3. F5, I think the real point of F5 is that at the moment there's no effective discovery for the bishop against my knight on E6. And I am in a lot of lines just threatening F4, taking a whole lot of space and really just frustrating the white kingside pawns. I was reluctant to go F5 because I was so hell-bent on anchoring this knight on E6 for as long as possible, so I didn't want to kind of give that activity, but it just kind of works here. The other move is rook b3, and rook b3 makes more sense to me. You fix the b2 pawn. Now the bishop d2, bishop c3 maneuver doesn't work because it just hangs a pawn, and so I kind of tie white down here in a really effective way. But I went h5, and white is still alive. White now went rook c2, which is fairly reasonable given the circumstances. And here, I think the idea is to actually trade these pawns because, again, if you trade pawns, you get closer to a drawing position. Like, for instance, if you have 3 versus 2 in a rook endgame on the king side, with the best play, it's a draw. And with the bishop and the knight on the board, it might be a little bit harder just because the knight might jump around and because the knight is a tricky piece practically. But objectively, the position is just a draw. So that's kind of the thing that white wants to get to, is to trade some of these pawns on the queen side to get to those drawn positions on the king side. So after rook c2, I went king g7, just trying to improve my position on the king side a bit more. And now white played the move c5, which does, get him closer to this c6 move. I played the move rook b3, trying to discourage c6 best I can, because I thought now if c6 I can take and then take on b2 with check and actually win a pawn. And if I'm 2 pawns up, I think the quality of my pawns will matter less. And so that was kind of my rationale with rook b3, just holding up this c6 idea. And now Yudasin played the move bishop c1, protecting b2 and pretty much trying to insist on the c6 idea, which is a really nice attempt, even though it shouldn't really work with best play. Now, the best move in this position is actually one I did not play, but I'll show you that first. Knight d4 here would just be really effective. I was very reluctant to do so because after rook c4, which is really the only logical move to attack my knight, the point is I'm going to c6 and I'm holding up the c5 move to actually ensure that pawns don't get traded on the queen side. But I was actually worried about allowing bishop takes g5 and rook takes b2 because I thought that somehow having split pawns on the king side would kind of not be attractive. But the key thing here is that the presence of both my pawns here on the queen side just wins the day. And so after rook takes b2, king f1, a5, black is going to just win this one in the long run because the king is really cut off. This rook is super active. And just making sure that the c and b pawns are still on the board means that A, the c pawn is a target and the b7 pawn is less so because it's on a light square. And B, white actually has less files to actually operate with for the rook. So you can see that with the c pawn gone, the rook really does not have a whole lot of mobility. And even on the fourth rank right now, there aren't a whole ton of squares that he could go to. And so that's why it's actually more valuable to keep the pawns on the queen side than create split pawns on the king side. I didn't know that, so I actually played the move rook b5. And rook b5, basically, prompts this exchange of the pawns, which, isn't ideal. So after c6, I pretty much am obliged to play b takes c6. I mean, if I go knight d4, that's a way to actually lose the game because now c7 would be one of those unfortunate gaffes where I just allow a queen, and so I wasn't going to do that. So I now have to take that pawn. I threw in rook f5 check first just to kind of, I thought, bring the king out of position because I thought that if the king, first of all, I can't go to e2 because I have knight d4 check. And I thought if it goes to e3, it might be cut off from its own kingside pawns. And so white played the move king g1, and now I actually took on c6, and I thought, you know what, this might be a small victory because essentially I've actually, I did manage to trade pawns on the queen side, which is not great, but at least now the king is kind of stuck in this box on the king side. And, I did talk about kind of fixing white's pawns on the king side with h4. Now I'm closer to that than ever. Now, it actually turns out here that the position is already very, very difficult to hold and is nearly lost, even with me kind of bungling it just a little bit. And here, believe it or not, the move that you need to play is actually b4. b4, I think, is just one of these really almost impossible moves to see from afar because you're basically, it looks like willingly staying 2 pawns down. But the point is that rook takes c6 just doesn't work tactically. So with b4, just to show you, the point is that I don't really have a useful move to, defend this pawn. And if I play c5, I'm just going to, trade it, and then white's going to actually take on g5. And all of a sudden, we're going to have a position where there's a 3 versus 2 that's actually, kind of unclear. Now, it is winning in the long run, I think, but just to show you, rook b5, rook c4, c5, takes, and we get to this endgame, and it requires a really, really good technique to win this because, again, the bishop is a long-range piece and can pretty much attack and defend at the same time. So the bishop reroutes itself on this diagonal, and it's just very tricky. I'm going to just zoom through some lines just to show you the main ideas. But basically, the point is the winning strategy for black is actually managing to keep the pawns on the board on the king side long enough to be able to actually create enough of a distraction to actually win White's kingside pawns. So the point is, in a lot of lines, the big idea is that whenever white goes g4, you actually can't take it. You actually go h4. And the point is you actually reroute your knight to g5, amazingly, to target the pawn on h3. And then you actually kind of zug white in the long run. You get him in zugzwang because then the king can start to run over. But this type of position is very, very difficult to hold, even if white doesn't play g4, or to win, rather. So, like, if bishop b2, I have to spin around, try to create some type of weakness. The point with knight e6 still is that if knight g5, now I'm trying to get white to play h4 because then there's no pawn break. So if you go like bishop a1, now knight g5, h4, now, black is thrilled because now this king can come in and the h5 pawn stays on the board forever. So you don't do that. You go king f3, try to not play h4, but eventually black spins the knight around enough where the king can invade. And again, you eventually force h4 in the long run and then invade and win the game. But man, I think that's a very, very tough endgame to kind of demonstrate. And I think white has really, really excellent drawing chances there. Yeah, definitely b4 is a nice defensive try that's really effective. Instead, after b takes c6, Yudasin took on c6 right away with the rook. And this move actually should lose right away because of the move knight d4, which I played. And the point with knight d4 is now the rook on c6 is pretty much tethered to the c file because I'm threatening knight e2 check. And the whole issue with that is that once I play knight e2 check, the king is actually in a mating net because it's really locked in this box here and really lacks squares. So after knight d4, rook c4 was played, and now I went knight e2 check, and then king h2 was played. And remarkably here, black actually is just winning on the spot. And so I'm going to give it to you to pause the video and try to figure out black to play and win from this position. All right, hopefully you got a chance to look at it and try to figure out how black should win this one. I did not play this move. I did not find it, and again gave white more chances in this endgame because the best move, the winning move, is actually g4. And it's amazing here because I was thinking about mating nets a lot, but it just totally escaped me that I can even allow white to capture on g4 with check. Because the point is I'm threatening g3 and rook f1 mate, and you can't tolerate that, so you have to take on g4. But after h takes g4, I'm also threatening rook h5 mate, and that's actually the huge problem, is that after rook takes g4 check, because what else, now after king f6, I'm still threatening rook h5 mate, and the bishop on c1 is now hanging. And so white can't defend both, and you defend one, I take the other, and I'm just a piece up. And so this really simple, a relatively simple 3-4 move calculation would have just allowed me a win on the spot, and it's quite a unique pattern, but it's something I should have seen. Instead, and we were in a little bit of time trouble. I mean, this was past move 40. We got our extra 15 minutes of time, which is a strange time control in this one where you get 15 minutes after move 40. I could have, probably seen this one, but I was really playing on 10, 15 minutes, and I wasn't taking a lot of time with decisions because I wanted to, keep the pressure on him on the clock. And so I played knight takes c1, and the reason I did that is because I figured that this endgame was still also probably winning, just with the king being so passive on h2 and with the presence of the b and a pawns here. If the b and a pawns were off the board, the 3 versus 2 would be a draw. But I thought with this factor, I think I have enough to win. So after knight takes c1, rook takes c1, I was like, okay, this position is, probably a win because I don't see how they can get rid of these pawns. So in this position, though, you still have to be very, very precise. And believe it or not, there's actually only one move here that wins. So I'm actually going to give you the opportunity to pause the video and try to find out what that move is here, because this is another critical moment where I kind of just got it wrong. So, just think on it for a moment. All right, hopefully you got that moment. The move here that that is the precise one that wins is actually a5. And it's kind of funny because I got a position that was similar to this a few moves later, and I was back in winning territory, but it's important that I do it now. And the reason for that is you will see in a moment, because the point is that after a5 here, if h4, I go g4, and if like rook c4, I go rook b5. And you can see white successfully did not trade the b for the a pawn, and now I'm also, my pawns on the fifth rank are protected, and now I can walk my king over and get it active, and that is typically the winning maneuver. Now, instead, I played the move rook b5 right away. And I didn't think there was a major difference between this, but it's surprisingly there is. And unfortunately for me, Yudasin did not see this. But after rook b5, remarkably, now h4 actually holds the game. And it looks truly miraculous, because you're like, well, what's the difference here? What has changed? Can I still go g4? So after g4, the key thing is now that there's this amazing move b4. And amazingly here, the point is that after rook takes b4, rook c6 actually holds the game. The point is that if I go rook a4 and try to defend the pawn like that, now there's rook c5, and even though I'm 2 pawns up, I'm not going to hold both my h and my f pawn. And if white gets one of them, it's going to be a draw. And so if I go king g6, there's rook g5 check, and after king h6, rook f5, and you can see I can't hold both of these pawns. And then the alternative to that is trying to go rook b4, trying to get cute, so that after rook takes h5, it actually run into a little bit of a trap with rook b5, and now I actually managed to trade the rooks and get to a winning pawn endgame. You don't have to allow that, because you can start with the move rook c6. And again, if I go rook a4, we go back. We can repeat in this type of position with rook b4, rook c6, rook a4, rook c5. And if I go a5, the other obvious alternative, now rook c5 is a double attack against h5 and a5. And so basically, allowing b4, this temporary pawn sack, gives white the necessary counterplay to actually get to one of these 3 versus 2 endgames that I'd actually been discussing for a while now that are a draw. But it's a very, very unusual way to get there. Just remarkable defense. But amazing how the computer will show you stuff like this. Now, the other thing you might be wondering is, in these lines with h4, why not g takes h4? And in general here, you really don't want to have positions where you have multiple h-pawns. Just h-pawns in general, rook pawns, they're not going to be very helpful. And so in a lot of lines, it's more important to just keep the bind than to win a pawn in this way. So that's why g takes h4 is not really desirable. So fortunately for me, this maneuver was not seen, this h4, b4 maneuver. And instead, Yudasin played rook c2. And now I'm back on the completely winning course by playing the move h4. Because now I've managed to fix the structure on the king side, and I can now start to slowly encroach on the queen side. And white is just too passive. And one of the unfortunate things is you might say, well, what about g4 or something like this? Well, maybe g3 is a little bit more precise, trying to actually trade the pawns. Well, the issue here is that after h takes g and king takes g4, I now always, have the move rook b4. Or not even rook b4. I can even go, rook b4 looks reasonable. And basically the point is, you're not really trading the h3 pawn for the g5 pawn, at least not conveniently. And it's just pretty unpleasant. There may also be some scenarios where it doesn't really matter, frankly, because if I go like, I don't know, let's say I go f5, actually. Maybe f5 first is actually more precise. The point is now if h4, I have rook b3 check, and the king just has to back up and you lose a pawn. And if you don't trade the h pawn for the g pawn and it's just kind of a fixed weakness, my king can kind of creep up on it, and slowly I'm just going to push white back. And so that's kind of the big problem. So after h4, I felt firmly in control because white is in such a bind. So after h4, king g1 was played. And now I played a5. And you can see here I got pretty much everything I want on both sides of the board. And this is what you got to do. You got to slowly just kind of encroach on white's side. So king f2 is played. I now went king g6, just creeping upward. King e3. Rook b3 check, just to kind of challenge that king, make him make a tough decision. And king d4 was played. So Yudasin kind of recognized now that if I stay passive, I'm going to lose. Because if you go for king f2, now I'm just going to go a4, and the king is cut off on the third rank. The rook is tethered to the pawn on b2, and you just can't hold this one. I'm going to slowly prepare, f5 and g4. And yeah, I'm gonna make my king is gonna get active at some point. It's just not gonna work out. And so Yudasin was like, you know what, I'm gonna be active, and at least try this method. I now played a4 anyway, and the point was that not only do I protect my rook in some lines against king c4, I also just am being a little bit patient because the rook now on c2 really is tethered to the b2 pawn. So it's not like it can try to get rid of the a4 pawn now, because if you go for a move like rook c4, I just take on b2, and now I'm happy trading these pawns because the king is just so far away. So after a4, king e5 was played, which makes some sense, trying to kind of challenge me with rook c6 check. And now I just went f6 check, trying to get that king out of my face. After king e4, I now went rook g3, and I thought this was a pretty strong move. I thought that, not only is the king now kind of cut, it can't go towards the f-file, but it also can't bother me. I also thought the rook is also just tied on the second rank, so there's not much to do here. And I thought that this is really good technique, just having him run out of moves. And so now Yudasin played rook d2, just waiting, and now I played f5 check, and I'm slowly creeping upward. After king e5, I now played rook e3 check, and after king d4, I went f4. And f4 might seem a little bit, on the face of it, a little bit suspicious, because you might say, well, aren't you I thought your whole idea was preparing the g4 break. But I thought it was really important with f4 to ensure that the king is cut off more than anything else. And I envisioned potentially playing g4 at some point to break open the position, or even f3 if the king was not hitting the e3 rook. Because the other thing I have to think about now is if I get two connected passed pawns, that's going to be winning. So if somehow I'm able to play f3, after g takes f3, rook takes f3, maybe the h3 pawn is dropping, that's also going to be a favorable transition, especially with the king so far out of the way now, because it ran towards the center. So I thought f4 made a lot of sense. After f4, rook c2 was played, and now I played the move king h5, just kind of scurrying away, just trying to escape from checks for now. It was important to me to not allow rook c6 check and then rook c2 back, and I obviously the king can't come forward, so the rook is the only one that can really move. And I thought that if you go rook c6 now, I just have rook e2, and I'm just securing the second rank with a winning position. So white now went rook f2, because what else? You have to kind of wait on the file, or on the second rank. And I went king g6 back. And after rook c2, I was like, man, this is kind of tenacious, because if he makes any other move besides rook f2, I could just play g4 there and not hang my f4 pawn. So in this position, I was kind of gearing up for g4, but of course here it doesn't work because rook takes, not rook f3, rook takes f4, and then I have some problems. So really I wanted to play g4, but this rook f2 move didn't allow me to, and I was like, how do I improve? So I went back with king g6, and then after rook c2, I realized now I can first start with rook b3. And this is important just to kind of keep an eye on the b2 pawn again. And after king e4, I went rook e3 check. And after king d4, I got enough time that I realized I was repeating, and that was a bad idea. I finally went for it with king f6. And the whole point with king f6 was to kind of potentially get my king over towards the queen side, but also, force white to make another difficult decision. And again, if black is, if white is passive, you go like rook f2, I can probably creep up with king f5 or even king e6. And so instead, rook c6 was played. And I went rook e6, and this was something that I was really happy with because now I have the option of playing f3 without my rook being a hanging piece on e3. And now after rook e6, rook c2 back, you have to do to guard the second rank. I now played the move g4, and here I finally found, or basically the winning idea, which was to break through without the f4 pawn hanging. And all of a sudden here, it's going to be very difficult to hold everything together because I'm threatening all the time f3 or g3, and my pawns are just going to crash through. And so you really can't tolerate that. And so white played the move h takes g4. But now after king g5, my king has a highway through the g file, and that kind of seals the deal. And so now it's just a little bit of a matter of technique. I'm not even worried about the a4 pawn anymore if I have two very far advanced passed pawns and a king that's basically cut off from the game. And so now white tried to get active with rook c8, but now after the very precise rook g6, I'm also shielding my king from checks, and this allows me to get my king further up the g file. And so king d4 was played. I went king takes g4, and after rook c4, trying to get at my f4 pawn, I have rook g5 check, a very important move, just kicking the king out of my face again. And then after king e4, I went rook g8, and this move I really, really like because now not only am I still have the threat of king g3, but the bigger thing is making sure this king on e4 is cut off from the action. And now with rook e8, because I have opposition here, the king really would have to back up the other way to the d file, and that would ensure that the king is still cut off. So rook takes a4 is played, but after rook e8 check, king d3, rook e3 check, king d2, now I can just go rook g3 and just round up the f3 pawn, or the g2 pawn, and I knew that having two pawns this far advanced, even though they're split, would be winning for me. So white now went king e2, and I went rook takes g2 check, and now I went king f1. And it's funny here because if the king was in a slightly better position, if the king was maybe on h2, H and F versus, H and F even without the B pawn in some circumstances drawn, like two pawns up, but having H and F can be drawn. But the issue here is that the king is not in the drawing zone. And what I mean by that is it's just kind of cut off, and so it's very difficult to kind of hold this position. And it's just losing. I knew that because I have this move H3. And the key idea with H3 is that my rook is now protected, and the king, again, is cut off from the g file. And in a lot of lines, I'm just threatening to go h2 and rook g1 check, queening my h pawn if my rook on g2 winds up being protected. And so now, after rook a8, which was played, I now played the very important move f3. And this is kind of the coup de grace of the situation, is that with f3, I'm threatening, as the arrows highlight, h2 and rook g1. And the problem is that after rook g8 check, which Yudasin played, I can just run away with my king because rook trades now just don't work, because after rook takes g2, h takes g2, and king f2, I actually can just run my king over. Well, I'd probably run it over a different way. I'd probably run it over this way to secure the b pawn. I'm in the square, and white never can take the f3 pawn without the g pawn queening. So after king f2, I just go king e5, and basically, white is pretty much at my mercy while I collect the b pawn. And then as soon as I do that, I would just spin back, and that would be it. And so because of that problem, white cannot trade the rooks, and I just move my king away. And after king f4, you can't go for rook h8 because there's h2. And this is the key idea, is my rook on g2 is protected by my f pawn, then I can go rook g1 check, and then h1 queen. And so after king f4, Yudasin tried a few spite checks, played rook f8 check. I went king e4, still holding on to the f3 pawn, which is important. And then after rook e8 check, I went king d5, and I'm pretty much darting. I'm going to dart toward the rook just so that he can run out of checks. And in this position, Yudasin actually resigned, because if you go rook f8, I have h2. And if you go rook d8 check, still checking, I just go king c6, and you run out of checks. And as soon as you run out of checks, I go for h2. So yeah, after king d5, that was it. And I won a very, very long and tenacious endgame, which could have been a little bit simpler if I was a little more tactically alert at various moments. But I was happy with my technique, particularly in the rook ending, because I did feel it was winning, and it was. I just had to be a little bit more precise, and I was precise enough. So I was happy with that. I was definitely happy with the way the opening went. I don't think I'd ever played the black side of an Italian before, so it was really cool to play something for the first time and for it to actually work. That's always amazing. So anyways, with this game, I actually was back on 50% with 3 rounds to go, and that also felt good. So I still felt like I had some tournament ahead of me. So anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I know it was a long one. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.